Don't move. Hands up right now.
Hands are up. I have
I'll
done
be the
nothing
judge
wrong.
of that.
Sir, I am informing you that I have a legally holstered firearm. I am active military. My permit is current.
Back away from the vehicle.
Backing away.
I would like to retrieve my military.
It was close to 11 at night when Erica Ford pulled into the gas station. Tank low, shoulders tight, 2 hours of highway behind her, and the kind of family visit that leaves you quieter than when you left. She was not expecting anything from that stop except fuel and cold water. She got Sheriff Marcus Taylor instead. He pulled in while she was at the pump. Not the way a patrol car drifts through a quiet lot on a routine pass. The way a vehicle enters when it has already chosen a destination. She heard the engine before she saw the lights. She turned slowly, both hands coming visible without being asked, because that particular reflex does not require a command when you have spent enough time understanding what certain moments cost. Taylor's hand was on his holster before he finished stepping out. What followed lasted less than 3 minutes. What followed after that lasted years. If you are ready to see this story through to justice like this video, drop a comment letting me know where you are watching from, and subscribe if you have not already. Let me know if you are enjoying the story. We are just getting started. It was 11:07 on a Thursday night when Erica Ford turned off the interstate and pulled into the Hayfield Express station on Route 14. The tank was nearly empty. Her phone was charging slowly on the passenger seat. She had been driving for just over 2 hours, the visit behind her still sitting somewhere in her chest the way certain conversations do when they have not been resolved so much as abandoned. She pulled to pump 4, cut the engine, and sat for a moment. Not because anything was wrong, because the body, after 2 hours of highway, sometimes needs a second to agree that the destination has changed. She was 38 years old. She had completed 3 overseas deployments, led units in conditions where the margin between a good decision and a catastrophic one was measured in seconds, and returned each time with a service record that her commanding officer had described in language that was not given to people who did not earn it. She had been stationed at Fort Bellings for 4 years. She drove home when the calendar allowed, which was less often than she would have chosen and more often than the assignment technically permitted. She was not in uniform. That mattered in ways that would become clear later. Her sidearm was holstered on her right hip, legally carried, worn openly as regulations required for active personnel traveling between installations. She had checked it at the start of the drive the same way she checked the mirrors and the fuel gauge, once methodically without ceremony. It was part of the equipment. That was all it was. Erica stepped out of the vehicle. The night air carried the flat coolness of late autumn. She swiped her card at the pump, entered her PIN, and waited for the machine to authorize. Through the plate glass of the station, a night attendant was reorganizing a shelf near the back cooler. He glanced out when her car pulled in, the reflexive look of someone in the last third of a long shift, taking inventory of the lot without meaning to. He looked back at his shelf. She was a woman at a pump, going about her business. The pump began. Erica stood beside the car with one hand resting on the roof and her eyes on nothing in particular, allowing the drive to settle out of her shoulders. She was not watching the road when the headlights entered the lot. She heard the cruiser before she saw it. Not the particular slowness of a vehicle circling a quiet lot. Not the casual drift of a late-night patrol checking perimeter out of habit. This was a vehicle entering with a direction already selected, an engine that had made its choice before it reached the turn. The overhead canopy lights caught the hood first, then the full silhouette, and then the cruiser stopped at an angle that placed its front bumper behind her rear quarter panel and blocked the driver's door. The lights stayed off. No siren. No announcement. Erica had already noticed this cruiser once before. Approximately 4 minutes earlier, it had passed the station entrance at a speed that was not quite a passing speed. She had registered it the way she registered most things in an unfamiliar environment. Not with alarm but with attention. That was a distinction she had trained into herself over years, in which the gap between noticing and reacting had sometimes been the difference between a situation managed and a situation lost. She did not move toward the phone in her jacket pocket. She moved it with 2 fingers into the outer breast pocket and activated the audio recorder in a single, quiet motion, the way someone closes a window before it rains. Not dramatic, not heroic. A precaution built from the particular experience of someone who had been doubted before and knew how quickly official language could reshape what had actually happened. Sheriff Marcus Taylor stepped out of the cruiser. He was 49 years old. He moved with the weighted deliberateness of a man accustomed to being the settled authority in whatever space he entered. He did not scan the lot the way a professional scans an unknown situation, neutrally, gathering information before committing to a read. He walked directly toward Pump 4 with the focus of someone who had already completed his assessment in the car and was now proceeding to its conclusion. His eyes moved to her holster. Then they stayed there. Erica turned slowly, both hands rising to shoulder height without being asked, palms forward, fingers separated. She had done this before in her mind, not because she expected it, but because in certain environments, not thinking through the possibility is itself a form of unpreparedness. She stated, in an even voice, that she was stopping for fuel. She asked the reason for the contact. Taylor told her to step away from the vehicle. She stepped away, hands still raised, voice still level. She asked whether she was being detained and on what basis. The question landed in a way that shifted something in his posture. His hand moved to the holster without completing a draw, a gesture that occupied the space between control and threat. He told her to show her identification. She said her identification was in her jacket pocket and asked how he wanted her to retrieve it. He told her not to reach. She said she had to reach to produce the identification he had just asked for. He repeated that he had not given permission to reach. She registered the structure of this exchange without expression. The commands were not designed to be satisfied simultaneously. That was not an accident. She had been in rooms with uncertain men holding loaded weapons, and she knew the difference between orders meant to ensure safety and orders meant to establish absolute control over another person's body. She kept her hands where they were. Then Marcus Taylor said something beneath the level of a formal command. Something muttered, half-formed, about people like her always having a reason, always having an excuse, always thinking the rules did not apply the same way twice. Erica asked him to repeat it. Something crossed his face. A brief, involuntary visibility, the look of a man who has allowed something out that belongs inside. It lasted less than a second. Then it was gone, replaced by something that had hardened around the edges. He told her to keep her hands visible. She said clearly that she was reaching for her identification, that her sidearm was holstered, that she was active military and her permit was current. The shot came before the sentence was finished. It entered her right shoulder and turned the world sideways. She went down beside Pump 4. The coffee cup on her car roof fell and rolled under the vehicle. The pump continued its mechanical count, indifferent and exact. Erica Ford was conscious when she hit the ground. She was conscious when Marcus Taylor keyed his radio and began to speak. She heard the language he chose. She heard the word suspect used in place of her name. She heard the phrase reaching for a weapon used in place of what had actually happened. She was conscious for all of it, lying on the concrete beneath the station lights with both hands still visible and her shoulder burning and her phone still recording in her jacket pocket. She understood, clearly and without confusion, that there were now 2 versions of this night. His version had already been filed. Hers was still in her pocket, waiting. Inside the station, through the plate glass, the night attendant stood motionless with his hand on the shelf he had stopped restocking. He was looking at the lot. He had seen everything from the moment the cruiser blocked her door. He had not moved yet. He did not look like a man deciding whether to act. He looked like a man deciding how afraid to be. At the edge of the lot, a delivery van that had been parked along the far curb for the last 12 minutes had its interior dark and its engine quiet. The driver had reached for his phone approximately 40 seconds before the shot. Marcus Taylor stood beside his cruiser and continued to speak into his radio. His voice was even. His report was already taking shape. He had written reports before. He understood the vocabulary. He understood that a report filed first, filed in the standard language of officer safety and suspect noncompliance, was a report that held. What he had not considered was the camera mounted on the canopy support above pump 4, angled downward at the concrete below, recording the lot with the total indifference of a machine that does not know what is at stake and does not require anyone's permission to continue. Erica's hands had been visible from the moment the cruiser's lights came on. They were visible still. The pump finished. The receipt printed and curled in the night air above her car, uncollected. The most dangerous part of that night was not the bullet. The bullet had already found its mark. The most dangerous part was the 4 minutes that followed, in which one man with a badge and a radio worked to ensure that what had happened would be recorded as something else entirely, and in which the only thing standing between his version and the truth was a wounded woman on the concrete, a frightened clerk behind plate glass, a stranger with a phone in a dark van, a camera that had seen everything, and a recording that had started before any of it. Marcus Taylor's report was filed at 12:41 in the morning. It used the language such reports always use. Failure to comply, erratic movement, reasonable fear for officer safety. Suspect reached toward a holstered firearm. Each phrase had been chosen not to describe what happened at pump 4, but to construct a version of it that the system would recognize and accept. He had written reports before. He understood that the first version on record was not simply one account among many. It was the frame through which every account that followed would be measured. Erica Ford was in surgery when the report was submitted. The bullet had entered her right shoulder at an angle that required 2 hours and 17 minutes to address. The surgical team worked with precision and without hurry. The outcome was not guaranteed until the final suture. She was sedated and unavailable. Her belongings were bagged at the scene. Her phone was among them. Marcus had no reason to believe the phone mattered. By the time Erica was in recovery, his version of the night had already been transmitted to his supervisors, logged into the county system, and forwarded to the department's legal liaison. The word suspect appeared 4 times. Her name appeared once in the demographic field. She woke in the early morning with her shoulder immobilized and her mind already working backward through the sequence of the night. She did not ask immediately about pain management or about her family. She asked the attending nurse whether her personal belongings had been secured and whether the scene cameras at the station had been documented by investigators. The nurse answered only the first question. Erica registered what the silence around the second question might mean and filed it carefully. She asked, before the morning was over, whether an attorney had been contacted. She asked whether the department's internal affairs division had been notified separately from the sheriff's office. She asked these questions with a steadiness that the attending staff noted without fully understanding. They had not been told who she was. They had been told only what the intake paperwork said, which was the word the report had given her. Investigators arrived at the Hayfield Express station the following morning. They worked the exterior first, mapping the lot, documenting the pump positions, noting the cruiser's blocked angle. The camera mounted on the canopy support above pump 4 had been recording on a continuous loop. The footage was clear. The investigators pulled it, loaded it on a department tablet at the edge of the lot, and watched it without speaking. What the footage showed was not what the report described. Erica's hands were visible from the moment the cruiser's headlights entered the lot. They remained visible through the contradictory commands. They were visible when the shot was fired. Her right hand, at the moment Marcus discharged his weapon, was not at her holster. It was at the level of her jacket's outer breast pocket, moving at the pace of someone who has announced a motion and is completing it slowly enough to be watched. Her holster was 6 inches lower and to the right. The distance was not ambiguous. The footage was not ambiguous. The investigators noted the discrepancy without editorializing. They set it beside the report and continued working. At this point in the story, one question asks itself before the next piece of evidence arrives. Whether Marcus Taylor was afraid of what Erica Ford was doing at Pump 4, or whether he had already decided what she was before she ever moved. Type planned or panic in the comments and let the story know where you stand. The second item came from the delivery van parked along the far curb. The driver had come forward that morning, not immediately, but after sitting in his vehicle outside the station for 9 minutes in a way that the body camera footage from a county vehicle passing the lot happened to capture. He handed his phone to investigators without being asked. The recording was 37 seconds. Vertical, slightly shaky, shot through the windshield glass from 40 feet away. It was clear enough. It showed Erica's posture. It captured, faintly but audibly, the sound of her voice announcing her movement in a measured tone before the shot ended the sentence. The third item was Marcus's own body camera. It had been activated 6 seconds into the contact. That delay was itself a protocol violation, a footnote the investigators marked and set to the side for the moment. What the body camera had captured in its 9 active seconds before the discharge was a sequence of commands that could not be simultaneously satisfied. The timestamp confirmed that Erica's last audible announcement preceded the shot by 1.3 seconds. 3 sources. 3 independent records. 1 consistent conclusion. Then the investigators reached the evidence bag containing Erica's personal belongings, and they found the phone. The audio file had been running for 11 minutes and 44 seconds before the recording ended at the moment of impact. The investigators transferred the file and played it at half speed in the mobile unit. The first 40 seconds were ambient, the sound of the pump, distant traffic, the mechanical hum of the canopy lights. Then came the sound of a vehicle entering the lot. Then Marcus Taylor's voice. Not directed at Erica. Not part of any command. A voice speaking to no one, in the space between the cruiser door and the first step across the concrete, in the particular register of a man who does not believe anyone is listening. What he said in those seconds was not loud. It did not need to be. It was enough. It established, with the indifference of recorded sound, that his suspicion had not been created by anything Erica did at Pump 4. It had arrived with him. It had been in the cruiser before he stepped out. Whatever explanation he had written into the official report about instinct and perceived threat and split-second professional judgment, the audio reduced it to what it actually was. A conclusion reached before the encounter began and a weapon discharge used to enforce it. The investigators sat with that for a long moment. Then they requested everything Marcus Taylor had ever filed. What came back from records was not a surprise to the people who had worked alongside him and said nothing. It was a documentation of what they already knew. Complaints marked inconclusive. Use of force reviews closed without finding. Traffic stop logs that showed a pattern visible only when placed beside each other and measured against a single variable. In the 14 months before the night at Pump 4, Marcus had responded to 2 separate encounters involving legally armed civilians. Both had been resolved without escalation. Both individuals had been white men. Off-duty military, one of them. The contact logs recorded courtesy, patience, professional deference. The encounters had been, by every official measure, unremarkable. The third encounter had been Erica Ford. Same county. Same visible holster. Same legal carry. The only variable that distinguished the third encounter from the first 2 was documented in the demographic line. No editorializing was required. The records spoke in the flat, procedural language of official documentation, and that language, when laid side by side, was damning precisely because it was so plain. Before the week ended, a second person came forward. The night attendant from the station, the one who had stood behind the plate glass and watched the entire encounter without moving. He had spoken briefly to investigators on the first morning and offered very little. He had described his vantage point as limited. The investigators had noted this and returned to it. When they came back a second time with a legal advocate present, he spoke more fully. Marcus Taylor had entered the station 3 months earlier over a minor building code issue. He had not written a citation. He had not filed a formal complaint. He had made clear, through the specific weight of implication that men in authority sometimes use instead of direct threat, that problems could be managed differently depending on how cooperative a business chose to be. The attendant had understood. He had been cooperative. He had stayed quiet. He handed investigators a written statement on the second visit. His hands were not steady while he signed it. If hidden evidence and the courage of one frightened witness are what finally bring the truth into a courtroom, share this story. Because truth does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives late and trembling, and still it arrives. By the end of the second week, Marcus Taylor was no longer protected by the clean simplicity of a filed report and a badge. The evidence did not point in multiple directions. Pointed in one. And what it pointed toward was not only a man who had fired a weapon without justification. It pointed toward a system that had watched him for years, collected his complaints, reviewed his conduct, and filed everything away in the language of procedure without once asking the question the records were quietly answering. The case had stopped being about a shooting at a gas station. It had become a reckoning. The courtroom did not look like justice. It rarely does at first. It looked like process, like procedure, like rows of strangers assembling in a room to perform a function that the law requires without guaranteeing the outcome the facts deserve. Marcus Taylor arrived on the first morning of trial in a press suit. His posture carrying the residual authority of a man accustomed to being the most powerful person in any given space. He had retained experienced counsel. He had supporters in the gallery. He had, for most of his career, operated in an environment where the weight of the badge translated cleanly into the weight of his word. The courtroom was one of the few spaces where that translation did not automatically hold. The prosecution did not begin with outrage. It began with sequence. Surveillance footage from the canopy camera played first, without commentary, without narration, without argument. The jury watched Erica Ford's hands. They watched the cruiser block her door. They watched the commands arrive too fast for compliance and contradict one another in real time. They watched the shot and the falling and the receipt curling above her car in the empty air. The footage ran for 3 minutes and 41 seconds. The silence in the room when it ended was the kind that does not require anyone to speak into it. The delivery van recording followed. 37 seconds, shaky and vertical and honest. The jury heard Erica's voice announcing her movement. They heard the shot interrupt the sentence. They heard the sound of something hitting concrete. Then came the body camera. 9 seconds of active recording, time-stamped and exact. They heard the contradictory commands. They heard the 1.3-second gap between Erica's final word and the discharge. They heard, in the procedural flatness of a camera that had been turned on too late to capture the beginning, the end of a sequence that should never have been started. The prosecution paused there. Let the jury sit with 3 separate, independent records, each confirming the same sequence, each contradicting the same report. Then they played the phone recording. The room shifted when Marcus Taylor's voice came through the speakers in those first 40 seconds. Not the command voice he had used at Pump 4. The other voice. The one he had used in the dark of his cruiser, directed at no one, in the private certainty of a man who does not believe he is being recorded. The jury heard it. The gallery heard it. Marcus Taylor, seated at the defense table, heard his own certainty played back to him in a room that was now measuring the distance between what he had filed and what the recording proved. His attorney objected. The objection was overruled. The prosecution then called the records custodian who had compiled Marcus's prior conduct files. The testimony was not dramatic. It was methodical, which was worse. Complaint filed. Outcome. Complaint filed. Outcome. Traffic stop log. Contact log. Incident report. The 2 prior armed encounters were entered into evidence. The jury was given time to read the contact notes. Patience. Courtesy. No escalation. No drawn weapon. No report filed. Then they were given Erica Ford's intake paperwork from the county emergency system. The word suspect, used in place of her name, for times before anyone had asked a single question. Several jurors stopped writing when the comparison was placed in front of them. They did not need to be told what they were looking at. Supervisors from Marcus's department testified, reluctantly and with the careful precision of people trying to answer questions without answering questions. They confirmed that prior complaints had been reviewed. They confirmed the outcomes. They confirmed that the use of force policy had been communicated annually. Under cross-examination, they confirmed that no complaint against Marcus Taylor had ever resulted in suspension, retraining, or formal sanction. The prosecutor asked, in the particular tone that does not require the question to be loud to land, what a complaint needed to contain before it resulted in consequence. No one answered that question cleanly. Marcus testified in his own defense. He spoke of instinct, of training, of the weight of a split-second decision made in conditions of perceived threat. His attorney guided him through a version of the night that was consistent with the language of the report, built from the same structural phrases, designed to occupy the space between his actions and accountability. The cross-examination did not shout it down. It dismantled it with the footage. His timeline did not match the timestamps. His description of Erica's posture did not match her recorded position. His account of her movement did not match the angle documented by the surveillance camera. Each contradiction was introduced not as argument but as recorded fact, placed beside his testimony and left there for the jury to measure. Erica Ford took the stand on the third day of trial. She was composed in the way that a person is composed when composure is not the absence of pain but the decision to carry it precisely. She testified to the sequence of commands and the impossibility of satisfying them simultaneously. She testified to the moment she noticed the cruiser circle the station and the reflex that led her to activate the recorder. Not as a dramatic act, not as strategy, but as the habitual caution of someone who had spent years in environments where her word, unrecorded, would not automatically be believed. She testified about the shoulder and the surgery and the months of recovery that followed. She testified about what it had cost her professionally and what it had taken from her sense of safety in ordinary spaces, at ordinary pumps, in ordinary clothes, in a country she had served at the level of commands that required other people's lives to be trusted to her judgment. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She finished each answer and waited for the next question. The courtroom was very still while she spoke. The jury deliberated for 11 hours over 2 days. The verdict, when it came, used the language of law, which is always less satisfying than the language of plain description but no less final. Guilty. The finding was clear. The abuse of authority was named. The racial bias underlying the conduct was addressed not in the verdict language but in the sentencing phase, where it was permitted to matter. Marcus Taylor stood when the judge spoke. The sentence was 30 years. The judge addressed the nature of the offense directly and without equivocation. Power of the kind granted to law enforcement officers is not granted to be used as a weapon against the people it is meant to protect. The abuse of that power, when fueled by bias and protected by institutional neglect, does not become less serious because the institution declined to notice it sooner. It becomes more serious. Marcus Taylor did not respond. He had run out of reports to file. Outside the courthouse, the county announced an independent review of the department's complaint and use of force procedures. Supervisors who had signed off on prior reviews were named in that announcement in a way that suggested they understood what the coming months would require of them. The language of the announcement was careful and administrative. What it meant, beneath the administrative language, was that the trial had opened a door that the department could not now close. Erica Ford left the courthouse without stopping for cameras. She had been precise and disciplined and composed for the entire duration of the trial, and she remained so now, moving through the corridor with the bearing of someone who has carried a great weight for a long time and is not yet ready to put it down, because she has not yet verified that the ground beneath her is level. The bullet had changed her life in the parking lot of a gas station on a night when she had stopped only for fuel and water. It had taken something from her that no verdict could restore. But what Marcus Taylor had not accounted for, what the system that protected him for years had also failed to account for, was the specific quality of the woman he had chosen to underestimate. She had noticed the cruiser circle once before it stopped. She had activated a recorder in the dark with 2 fingers and the reflex of someone who knew, without being able to explain it legally, that certain moments needed a witness the world had not yet agreed to provide. She had remained conscious on the concrete and understood, through pain and shock, that the most important thing she could do was survive with her memory intact. Quiet discipline. Foresight built from years of being doubted. A refusal to be erased. Those were not the qualities Marcus Taylor had looked for when he pulled into that lot. They were the qualities that ultimately destroyed him, not in a moment of dramatic confrontation, but across weeks of investigation and days of trial, in the slow and methodical way that truth sometimes insists on arriving when the evidence is patient enough to wait. If you made it to the end of the story, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Share this video if you believe that quiet courage and hidden evidence deserve to be seen. And subscribe, because tomorrow's story is another one they hoped would never come to light.